Working inside the Murmured estate was like living in two worlds at once. On the surface, Elena was simply a nurse caring for a dying old man. Antonio Murmured, the former Don, was in his 80s, ravaged by cancer and bitterness. He spent his days in a hospital bed set up in what had once been a grand bedroom, surrounded by medical equipment and the ghosts of his violent past. He barked orders, insulted Elena's competence, and occasionally threw things when the pain became too much. She tended to him with professional efficiency, giving him his medications on schedule, keeping him comfortable, and enduring his verbal abuse with patience. But beneath that surface, Elena was gathering intelligence. She learned the rhythms of the household, who visited when, which conversations stopped when she entered a room, and which continued as though she were invisible. She discovered that being a nurse made her the perfect spy. People in the family talked freely around her, treating her like furniture rather than a person who might be paying attention. She memorized meeting times, recorded names of associates, and noted tensions between different factions within the organization. Every few days, Elena would find ways to pass information to Marco. Sometimes it was through coded text messages on a secure phone he had given her. Other times, his people would arrange chance encounters during her rare breaks outside the estate. Slowly, piece by piece, Marco was building a complete picture of the Murmured operation, identifying vulnerabilities and planning his final move against Giovanni. 2 months into her assignment, Elena was changing Antonio's IV when he grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes, clouded with pain medication but still sharp in some ways, fixed on her face. "You're not like the others," he rasped. "They're all afraid of me, of this family. But you're afraid of something else. What are you running from, girl?" Elena carefully removed his hand, her heart pounding. "I'm not running from anything, Mr. Murmured. I'm just doing my job." "Liar," Antonio coughed out a bitter laugh. "I've been reading people my whole life. You carry guilt like a weight around your neck."
"I know that look because I've worn it myself."
"What did you do that haunts you so much?" She shouldn't have answered. Every instinct screamed at her to deflect, to maintain her cover. But something about the old man's directness, the recognition in his eyes of a fellow sinner, made her speak truthfully. "I helped kill someone," Elena said quietly. "Someone who didn't deserve it. Someone kind and good who showed me nothing but compassion. I did it because I was desperate and foolish, and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life." Antonio was silent for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Then he nodded slowly. "At least you feel guilt. That means you still have a soul. I stopped feeling guilty decades ago, and look where it got me. Dying alone, surrounded by people who are waiting for me to die so they can fight over my empire like vultures." Over the following weeks, a strange relationship developed between Elena and the old Don. He seemed to appreciate her honesty, the fact that she didn't pretend to respect him or his legacy. In his more lucid moments, he would talk about his life, about the choices he had made and the prices he had paid. He spoke about his son Giovanni with a mixture of pride and disappointment, recognizing that the younger Murmured had inherited his ruthlessness, but none of his strategic thinking. "Giovanni is reckless," Antonio confided one evening when the pain medication made him talkative. "He thinks violence is always the answer, that fear is enough to maintain power. But fear only works until someone stops being afraid. That Salvatore boy, the one whose mother we had killed, he's not afraid of us anymore. Giovanni should have left him alone, but he wanted to send a message. Now he's created an enemy who won't stop until we're all dead." Elena's hand stilled as she adjusted his blankets. This was the confirmation Marco had been waiting for. Direct admission that Giovanni had ordered the hit on Mrs. Salvatore. But Antonio wasn't finished. "I tried to tell Giovanni to make peace, to offer reparations, but he's too proud. He thinks killing one old woman makes him strong, makes him feared. All it did was guarantee our destruction. Marco Salvatore is smarter than all of us, more patient, more dangerous. He'll come for us eventually, and when he does, we won't see it coming until it's too late." "Why are you telling me this?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Antonio's laugh turned into a coughing fit that took several minutes to subside. When he could speak again, his voice was weaker but determined. "Because when the end comes, I want someone to know that I saw it coming, that I wasn't blind to my family's fate. And because I think you understand what it's like to be caught in the middle of someone else's war, used as a weapon by people who don't care if you survive. That night, Elena passed everything Antonio had said to Marco. His response came quickly. A single line of text that made her blood run cold. It's time. Get out tomorrow night during Giovanni's meeting. My men will be ready. The next day dragged by with agonizing slowness. Elena went through her normal routine, but her nerves were stretched to the breaking point. She had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, she felt unprepared. Around 8 in the evening, Giovanni's top lieutenants began arriving for their weekly strategy meeting in his office downstairs. The house security was focused on protecting that meeting, which meant less attention on other areas of the estate. At precisely 9 o'clock, Elena told the night guard she was taking her break to get some air. The guard barely looked up from his phone as she walked out the side door into the garden. Her heart hammered in her chest as she made her way toward the back gate where Marco's men were supposed to be waiting. Every shadow seemed threatening, every sound potentially hostile. She was halfway across the garden when she heard her name called. Elena froze, slowly turning to see Giovanni standing on the terrace, a gun in his hand and a cold smile on his face. "Did you really think we didn't know?" Giovanni asked, walking down the steps toward her. "That we wouldn't eventually figure out that the nurse who appeared so conveniently was actually working for Marco Salvatore? We've been watching you, Elena, waiting to see how much you would reveal, how much damage you would do before we stopped you." Elena's mind raced. If they had known all along, then everything she had passed to Marco could be false information, deliberate misdirection. She might have been helping him walk into a trap instead of preparing him for victory. "My father liked you," Giovanni continued conversationally, still approaching. "He told me you were different, that you carried real guilt for something you'd done. He was always a good judge of character, even at the end. But sentiment has no place in business, Elena. You chose the wrong side, and now you'll pay for that choice." Before Giovanni could raise his gun, the night exploded with sound and fury. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Marco's men stormed the estate, moving with military precision. Giovanni dove for cover, and Elena ran, her lungs burning as she sprinted toward the gate. Bullets whizzed past her, and she heard screams from inside the house as the attack spread throughout the compound. Strong hands grabbed her as she reached the gate, pulling her through and into the relative safety of an armored vehicle. She looked up to see Marco himself, his expression grim as he watched his soldiers overwhelm the Moretti defenses. "You came yourself," Elena gasped, trying to catch her breath. "I wasn't going to risk losing you now," Marco replied. "Not after everything you've done. Are you hurt?" Elena shook her head, though she was shaking violently from adrenaline and fear. Through the vehicle's windows, she watched as Marco's forces systematically took control of the estate. It was brutal and efficient, a demonstration of the power Marco had been building during the years since his mother's death. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. When it was over, Giovanni Moretti was dragged out of the house in handcuffs by men who had once served his family, but had been secretly turned by Marco's influence and money. The old Don Antonio was found dead in his bed, having passed during the chaos. Whether he had died from his illness or had chosen to end things on his own terms, Elena would never know. Marco stood in front of Giovanni, his expression cold as ice. "You killed my mother to make me weak. Instead, you made me focused. Everything I've built, every alliance I've formed, every move I've made for the past 5 years has been leading to this moment. Your family is finished, Giovanni. Your people have abandoned you, your businesses are being seized, and your legacy will be remembered as a cautionary tale about the price of unnecessary cruelty." Giovanni spat blood at Marco's feet, defiant to the end. "You think you're different from me? You think you're better? You're just another killer, Salvatore. Just another monster in an expensive suit?" "Perhaps," Marco agreed. "But I'm the monster who won." What happened to Giovanni after that, Elena didn't want to know. Marco had his men take her back to the estate while he finished his business with the Morettis. She sat in the room that had been her home for months, processing everything that had happened, everything she had witnessed and been part of. When Marco finally returned hours later, he found her on the terrace watching the sunrise. He stood beside her in silence for a while before speaking. It was over. Elena stood in the corner of the room, shaking but unable to look away from what she had witnessed. She should have felt horror, should have been sickened by the violence. Instead, she felt something like relief, as though a weight she had been carrying was finally beginning to lift. The aftermath of that night changed everything. Marco's men disposed of Victor's body with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before, ensuring it would never be found. The gala continued without incident, and when Victor was eventually reported missing, the investigation would lead nowhere. In the world Marco inhabited, people disappeared all the time, and questions were rarely answered. Elena expected Marco to send her away or worse, fulfill his earlier threat about deciding her fate once his revenge was complete. Instead, he kept her at the estate, though her status shifted from prisoner to something she couldn't quite define. She was given more freedom to move around the property, and Marco's guards treated her with a respect that bordered on protectiveness. It was as though by witnessing Victor's end and maintaining her composure, she had proven herself in some way Marco valued. 3 days after the gala, Marco called Elena to his office. She entered to find him standing by the window, looking out at the grounds with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked tired, she realized, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much weight for too long. "Sit down, Elena," he said without turning around. "We need to talk about what happens next." Elena sat, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. She had thought about this moment constantly since that night, wondering if Marco's justice would eventually extend to her as well. After all, she had been the one to actually administer the poison, even if she hadn't known what she was doing. By some measures, she was more responsible for Mrs. Salvatore's death than Victor had been. "I've been thinking about what you said that night," Marco continued, finally turning to face her. "About facing justice. You were right that Victor should have been held accountable for his crimes. But you were also naive enough to think the legal system would have done it. That's the difference between us, Elena. You still believe in a world where good people are protected and bad people face consequences. I know better. I know better now too," Elena said quietly. "I've seen what happens when you try to work within a system that's broken. But that doesn't mean I can accept the alternative. What you did to Victor, what you do to protect your interests and eliminate your enemies, it's not justice, Marco. It's just more violence." Marco smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "You sound like my mother. She never approved of the family business, you know. She begged me to walk away, to use my education and do something legitimate. But I was my father's son, and this life was the only one I knew. It broke her heart, but she never stopped loving me." He moved to his desk and pulled out a folder, sliding it across to Elena. She opened it hesitantly and found documents inside, legal papers with her name on them, a new identity, a nursing license in a different state, and a bank account with enough money to start over anywhere she wanted. "This is your freedom," Marco said. "New name, new life, all the resources you need to disappear and never look back. My mother would have wanted you to have a second chance even after what happened. She was always too forgiving, too willing to see the good in people." Elena stared at the documents, her mind reeling. She could leave, start over, become someone else entirely. No more guilt, no more fear, just a clean slate in a place where nobody knew her past. It was everything she had dreamed about during those weeks of running and hiding. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, looking up at Marco. "I helped kill your mother. Why would you give me a chance to escape?" "Because you didn't know what you were doing," Marco replied. "Victor manipulated you, used your desperation against you. And when you realized what had happened, you didn't run to the police or try to bargain for your safety. You went to my mother's grave to apologize. That tells me something about who you really are, Elena. You made a terrible mistake, but you're not a bad person." Tears welled in Elena's eyes. She had expected punishment, expected to pay for her sins for the rest of her life. Instead, Marco was offering her forgiveness she didn't deserve, a gift from a man who showed mercy to almost no one. "I can't take this," she said, pushing the folder back toward him. "Running away won't change what I did. It won't bring your mother back. I need to face the consequences of my actions, whatever they are." Marco studied her for a long moment, something like approval in his dark eyes. "You're stronger than I thought. Most people would have grabbed this opportunity without a second thought. But you're right that running won't solve anything. So I have a different proposition for you." He explained his plan slowly, giving Elena time to process each part. The Murmured family was still out there, and Victor's death was only the beginning. Marco had learned from his investigation that the order to kill his mother had come from the top, from Giovanni Murmured himself, the head of the family. But Giovanni was well protected, surrounded by loyal soldiers and legitimate businesses that shielded him from retaliation. Getting to him would require careful planning and someone on the inside who could gather information. You want me to spy on them? Elena asked, incredulous. I'm a nurse, not some kind of secret agent. They'd see through me in seconds. Not as a spy, Marco corrected. As exactly what you are, a nurse. Giovanni's father, the old Don who retired years ago, is in poor health. He requires round-the-clock care, and the family goes through medical staff regularly because no one can tolerate the old man's temper for long. With your credentials and my connections, I can arrange for you to be hired. All you need to do is keep your eyes and ears open, learn their routines, and report back to me. It was dangerous and insane, and Elena should have refused immediately. But as Marco outlined the plan, she realized this might be her only chance to truly atone for what she had done. If she could help Marco dismantle the organization that had killed his mother, if she could prevent them from hurting anyone else the way they had hurt her, maybe she could find some measure of peace. How long would I have to do this? She asked. However long it takes to get what I need, Marco replied. Could be weeks, could be months. You'll have protection, hidden security watching you at all times. And if things go wrong, if your cover is blown, my men will extract you immediately. But I won't lie to you, Elena, this will be dangerous. The Morettis don't forgive betrayal, and if they discover what you're doing, they'll make you suffer before they kill you. Elena took a deep breath, thinking about Mrs. Salvatore, about the woman who had treated her with such kindness. She thought about her own mother, who had eventually gotten the surgery she needed thanks to the blood money Elena had accepted from Victor. She thought about all the other people who might fall victim to the Morettis if someone didn't stop them. I'll do it, she said firmly, but on one condition. When this is over, when you've gotten your justice and the Morettis have paid for what they did, you let me go. No more debts, no more obligations. I want to rebuild my life on my own terms, not as someone running from their past or trapped by it. Marco extended his hand across the desk. You have my word. Help me finish this and you'll have your freedom. No strings attached. Elena shook his hand, sealing a deal that would either save her or destroy her. As she left Marco's office, she felt strangely calm. For the first time since that terrible day, she had accepted Victor's money. She was making a choice based on something other than fear or desperation. She was choosing to fight back, to turn her guilt into action, to honor Mrs. Salvatore's memory by helping her son find justice. Over the next 2 weeks, Elena prepared for her new role. Marco's people provided her with a carefully constructed background story, complete with references and work history that would stand up to scrutiny. She studied everything they could learn about the Moretti family, memorizing faces and names, understanding the hierarchy and relationships. She practiced her cover story until it felt natural, until she could recite the lies without hesitation. The day finally came when she interviewed for the position as the old Don's nurse. The Moretti estate was a fortress disguised as a mansion, surrounded by high walls and armed security. Elena's hands shook slightly as she walked through the front door, but she forced herself to project confidence and competence. The interview was conducted by Giovanni himself, a man in his 50s with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. Your references are impressive, Miss Martinez, Giovanni said, looking over her fabricated resume. But my father is a difficult patient. He's demanding, often cruel, and has driven away every nurse we've hired in the past year. Why should I believe you'll be any different? Elena met his gaze steadily, channeling every ounce of strength she possessed. Because I understand that caring for difficult patients is part of the job. Mr. Moretti, I've worked with dementia patients, with people in chronic pain, with individuals who lash out because they've lost control of their lives. Your father deserves compassionate care regardless of how he treats me, and I'm committed to providing that. Something in her answer must have satisfied him, because Giovanni nodded and told her she could start the following day. As Elena, the information came through faster than expected. By evening, Judge Romano had delivered a complete file on Victor Castellano's movements, habits, and schedule. The lawyer would be attending a charity gala the following night, a high society event where the city's elite gathered to pretend they cared about the less fortunate while networking and making deals. It was the perfect cover for the kind of people who operated in shadows, and apparently, Victor never missed it. Marco spent the evening reviewing the security details for the event, mapping out exit routes and identifying potential complications. Elena watched from the corner of his office, feeling useless and increasingly anxious about what was coming. She hadn't left the estate since their visit to Judge Romano, and the weight of the impending confrontation pressed down on her like a physical force. "You don't have to come tomorrow night," Marco said suddenly, not looking up from the blueprint spread across his desk. "You've already identified him. I can handle the rest." Elena stood up, surprised by the offer. "You said you needed me to help you find everyone involved." "I did, but I can see you're afraid." Marco finally looked at her, his dark eyes studying her face. "You're not built for this world, Elena. You're a nurse, someone who's supposed to heal people, not watch them die. If you want to stay here tomorrow while I finish this, I'll understand." It was the closest thing to kindness Marco had shown her since this all began. But Elena shook her head. She had been a coward once, taking money and following orders without asking the hard questions. She wouldn't be a coward again. "I need to be there," she said firmly. "I need to face him and know that he can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt me and Mrs. Salvatore. I owe her that much." Something flickered in Marco's expression. Respect, maybe, or understanding. He nodded once and returned to his planning. "Then we'll go together. But Elena, whatever happens tomorrow night, you follow my instructions exactly. The Morettis are dangerous, and if they realize who you are or what you know, they'll kill you without hesitation." The next day passed in a blur of preparation. A stylist arrived at the estate and transformed Elena into someone she barely recognized. Her hair was styled in elegant waves, her face made up to hide the remaining traces of her illness. The dress they provided was simple but expensive, a deep blue that made her skin glow. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who could belong at a high society gala, not someone who had been living on the streets weeks before. Marco appeared at her door wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking every inch the wealthy businessman he pretended to be in public. He offered her his arm with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ready?" Elena took his arm, her heart pounding. "As ready as I'll ever be." The gala was held at a historic mansion converted into an event venue, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers. Luxury cars lined the circular drive as elegantly dressed guests made their way inside. Marco guided Elena through the crowd with practiced ease, nodding to acquaintances and exchanging brief greetings. To anyone watching, they looked like just another wealthy couple enjoying an evening of charity and socializing. But Elena could feel the tension radiating from Marco, the predatory focus beneath his casual demeanor. His eyes constantly scanned the room, tracking faces and movements. His bodyguards had entered separately and positioned themselves strategically throughout the venue. This wasn't a social visit. This was a hunt. "There," Elena whispered, her fingers tightening on Marco's arm. Victor Castellano stood near the bar, laughing at something another man had said. He looked completely at ease, confident and untouchable in his expensive suit. Seeing him again, knowing what he had done and how he had manipulated her, Elena felt rage surge through her veins stronger than her fear. Marco's jaw clenched, but his expression remained neutral. "Stay close to me. We're going to approach him naturally, like we're just mingling. Let me do the talking." They made their way across the room, stopping occasionally to exchange pleasantries with other guests. When they finally reached Victor, Marco smoothly inserted himself into the conversation with the kind of social grace that came from years of navigating dangerous situations while maintaining a respectable cover. "Victor Castellano," Marco said warmly, extending his hand. "Marco Salvatore. I don't think we've been formally introduced, though I've heard a lot about your legal work." Victor's smile didn't waver as he shook Marco's hand, but Elena saw recognition flash in his eyes. He knew exactly who Marco was and what family he represented. "Mr. Salvatore, the pleasure is mine. I'm always interested in meeting successful businessmen." "I'm sure you are," Marco replied smoothly. "Allow me to introduce my companion, Elena Martinez." When Victor's eyes landed on Elena, she saw the exact moment he recognized her. The color drained from his face and his practiced smile faltered for just a second before he recovered. But that second was enough. He was afraid. "Miss Martinez," Victor said carefully. "Have we met before? You look familiar." Elena found her voice, surprised by how steady it sounded. "We have, actually. You hired me once to do a job. I'm sure you remember." The tension between them was palpable now. Victor's companions had drifted away, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. Marco positioned himself slightly in front of Elena, a subtle but clear message that she was under his protection. "I think there's been some confusion," Victor said, his voice low. Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private. An excellent idea, Marco agreed. I know just the place. Marco's bodyguards materialized from the crowd, flanking Victor before he could protest. To any casual observer, it looked like a group of businessmen heading to a private room for a confidential discussion. But Elena could see the panic starting to creep into Victor's eyes as they guided him through a side door and down a hallway away from the party. They entered what appeared to be a study, lined with books and dominated by a large desk. As soon as the door closed behind them, Marco's demeanor changed completely. The charming businessman vanished, replaced by the cold, dangerous man Elena had first met at the cemetery. 5 years ago, you orchestrated the murder of my mother, Marco said quietly, his voice like ice. You used this woman, manipulated her fear and desperation to turn her into your weapon. You thought you could hurt me and get away with it because there was no direct evidence connecting you to the crime. Victor tried to maintain his composure, but sweat beaded on his forehead. I don't know what you're talking about. This woman is clearly disturbed, and you're making wild accusations based on nothing. Marco pulled out his phone and played a recording. Elena's eyes widened as she recognized her own voice, talking to Victor in that coffee shop months ago. Marco must have obtained the security footage somehow, had the audio enhanced. Victor's voice came through clearly, offering money, making promises about better medication for Mrs. Salvatore. I have 3 more recordings, Marco continued, as well as bank records showing the payment you made to Elena, traced back through multiple accounts to you. I have testimony from the pharmacy tech you bribed to provide the pills. I have surveillance footage of you watching my mother's house. I have enough evidence to bury you, Victor, and everyone will know the Murmured family sanctioned the murder of an innocent old woman. Victor's facade finally cracked. It wasn't personal. It was just business. Your family and ours have been at war for decades. Your mother was a strategic target, a way to weaken you. If you want revenge, take it out on the people who gave the order, not the soldier who carried it out. Oh, I plan to deal with everyone involved, Marco assured him coldly. But you, Victor, you're special. You didn't just follow orders. You enjoyed it. I can see it in your eyes, the pride you take in being clever, in manipulating people. You thought you were untouchable because you wore a suit and worked in an office instead of getting your hands dirty on the streets. Marco turned to Elena, his expression softening slightly. He used you, terrorized you, and then tried to have you killed when you became a liability. What do you think should happen to him? Elena looked at Victor, at this man who had destroyed her life and taken Mrs. Salvatore from the world. She thought about all the nights she had spent shivering in the cold, hungry and afraid, haunted by guilt. She thought about Mrs. Salvatore's kind smile and the way she had treated Elena like family. I think, Elena said slowly, that he should face justice. Turn him over to the police with all the evidence you've gathered. Let him spend the rest of his life in prison, knowing that his cleverness didn't save him in the end. Victor looked at her with desperate hope, clearly preferring prison to whatever Marco had originally planned. But Marco was already shaking his head. The police won't touch him, Elena. He has too many connections, too many people he's helped put in positions of power. A good lawyer, which he certainly can afford, would have him free in months. And even if he did go to prison, he would be protected by the Murmured family. He would live comfortably, maybe even continue his work from behind bars. Marco stepped closer to Victor, his voice dropping to a whisper. No, there's only one kind of justice that works in our world. What happened next would stay with Elena forever. Marco's justice was swift and brutal, a message sent not just to Victor but to everyone who had been involved in his mother's death. The days that followed blurred together for Elena. Marco had moved her to a secure room in his estate, more comfortable than any place she had lived in years, but unmistakably a prison. A nurse came twice daily to administer her medication and ensure she was eating. Marco's doctor, a nervous man who asked no questions, monitored her recovery with professional efficiency. Within a week, her fever broke and her strength slowly returned, though the weight of her guilt remained as heavy as ever. Marco visited her room every evening, always at exactly 8 o'clock. He would sit in the same leather chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and ask her questions. What did Dr. Russo look like? What was his accent? What kind of car did he drive? Did he ever mention names, places, or details about his life? Elena answered everything she could remember. watching as Marco's mind cataloged each piece of information like a predator, memorizing the patterns of its prey. On the 8th night, Marco arrived with a laptop. He set it on the bed in front of her and opened a folder filled with photographs. Dozens of faces stared back at her, men and women of various ages and backgrounds. Some looked like business people, others like criminals, and a few had the cold eyes of killers. Look through these carefully, Marco instructed. Tell me if you recognize anyone. Elena scrolled through the images, her heart pounding. Most of the faces meant nothing to her, strangers she had never seen before. But then she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. There he was, in a photograph taken at what looked like a formal event. He was older in this picture, his hair graying at the temples, but she would recognize those calculating eyes anywhere. That's him, she whispered, pointing at the screen. That's Dr. Russo. Marco leaned closer, his expression darkening as he studied the image. His real name is Victor Castellano. He's a lawyer who works for the Moretti family. They've been trying to move into my territory for years. The name Moretti sent a chill down Elena's spine. Even someone as disconnected from the criminal world as she was had heard whispers about the Moretti family. They were ruthless, violent, and had been engaged in a bloody war with the Salvatore family for as long as anyone could remember. This confirms what I suspected, Marco continued, his voice cold with fury. My mother's death wasn't random or accidental. It was a calculated strike designed to hurt me, to make me vulnerable while I was grieving. Victor probably thought that by using a nurse instead of a direct attack, they could avoid retaliation. After all, how could I blame them for a heart attack? But you did suspect them, Elena said quietly. Mrs. Salvatore mentioned once that you had been investigating something related to her death. Marco's eyes flashed with dark memory. I found evidence that Moretti soldiers had been watching my mother's house in the weeks before she died. I assumed they had confronted her, frightened her into the heart attack. I killed every man who had been involved in that surveillance, but I never knew about you, about the poison. They covered their tracks well. The casual way he spoke about killing people should have terrified Elena, but she felt strangely numb. She was already damned for what she had done. Whether Marco eventually killed her or let her live, nothing would change the fact that she had been the instrument of a good woman's murder. What happens now? She asked. Now we make them pay, Marco replied simply. But first you need to be strong enough to help me. Can you walk without getting dizzy? Elena nodded slowly. She had been practicing each day, pacing her room when the nurse wasn't there. Her body was still weak, but she was no longer on the verge of collapse. Good, tomorrow you're coming with me. We're going to visit someone who can tell us more about Victor Castellano and what the Morettis are planning. You'll need to identify him again in person this time. The thought of leaving the relative safety of her room terrified Elena, but she knew she had no choice. She owed Marco this much and far more. If helping him get justice for his mother meant putting herself in danger, then so be it. The next morning, Elena was given new clothes, simple but well made, and a coat that actually fit her properly. For the first time in weeks, she looked almost human again when she checked her reflection in the mirror. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, and some color had returned to her cheeks, but she could still see the haunted look in her eyes, the mark of someone who had done something unforgivable. Marco was waiting for her downstairs, flanked by two large men who Elena assumed were his bodyguards. He gave her a brief nod and gestured for her to follow him to a black SUV with tinted windows. The drive through the city felt surreal. Elena hadn't been outside in over a week, and the normal sights of people going about their daily lives seemed to belong to another world entirely. They pulled up in front of an upscale office building in the financial district. Marco led her inside and up to the 20th floor, where a receptionist took one look at him and immediately buzzed them through without asking any questions. They entered a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Behind a massive desk sat an elderly man with silver hair and sharp features dressed in an expensive suit. "Marco," the man greeted, though his tone was wary. "I wasn't expecting you." "I need information, Judge Romano," Marco said, getting straight to business. "About Victor Castellano and the Moretti family's recent activities." Judge Romano's eyes flickered to Elena, curiosity evident in his expression.
"And who is this young lady?"
"Someone who can identify the man who murdered my mother," Marco replied coldly. Now, are you going to help me, or do I need to remind you of the debt you owe me? The judge sighed and gestured for them to sit. Over the next hour, Elena listened as the two men discussed a complicated web of criminal activities, political connections, and family feuds. She learned that Judge Romano had been on Marco's payroll for years, providing insider information about legal proceedings and rival families in exchange for protection and money. It was corrupt and wrong, but Elena was in no position to judge anyone else's moral failings. According to the judge, Victor Castellano had recently been spotted meeting with several high-ranking Moretti members at a private club downtown. There were rumors of a major operation being planned, something that would shift the balance of power in the city. The judge didn't know the details, but he could find out if Marco gave him a few days. "I don't have a few days," Marco said quietly. "I want to know everything about Victor Castellano by tomorrow. Where he lives, where he works, who he associates with, and most importantly, where he'll be tomorrow night." "Can you do that?" Judge Romano nodded reluctantly. "Yes, but Marco, be careful. The Morettis have been quiet lately, which usually means they're planning something big. If you go after Victor, you might be walking into a trap." "Let them try," Marco replied with a cold smile. "I've been waiting 5 years for this. I'm not stopping now." As they left the office and returned to the SUV, Elena found her voice. "What are you going to do to him?" "To Victor?" Marco glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "What do you think I should do to the man who orchestrated my mother's murder? Who manipulated an innocent young woman into becoming his weapon? Who has probably destroyed countless other lives without a second thought?" Elena didn't have an answer. Part of her wanted Victor to suffer for what he had done, for the way he had used her guilt and desperation against her. But another part of her, the part that still believed in justice and law, knew that whatever Marco had planned would be brutal and permanent. "I think," she finally said, "that he should face justice. Real justice, not revenge." Marco was quiet for a moment before responding. "Justice is for people who live in a fair world, Elena. We don't. In my world, there's only power and the consequences of challenging it. Victor Castellano will learn that lesson before he dies." The certainty in his voice sent a shiver through Elena. She was committed to this path now, caught between her desire to atone for her sins and her fear of what she was helping to unleash. Tomorrow she would see Victor Castellano again, the man whose lies had destroyed her life and taken Mrs. Salvatore from the world. And when Marco had his revenge, Elena would have to decide if she could live with the blood on her hands, both past and future. Elena woke to unfamiliar surroundings. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting shadows across expensive furniture and dark wood paneling. She was lying in a large bed with silk sheets, still wearing her damp clothes, though someone had removed her muddy shoes and covered her with a thick blanket. Her head pounded and her throat felt like sandpaper. As her eyes adjusted, she saw him sitting in a leather chair near the window, watching her with an intensity that made her want to disappear. Marco Salvatore looked different without the rain obscuring her view. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 30s, with sharp features that would have been handsome if not for the coldness in his dark eyes. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, and even sitting casually in the chair, he radiated power and danger. This was the man Mrs. Salvatore had spoken of with such love and such worry, the son she had protected until her final breath. "You've been unconscious for 6 hours, Marco said, his voice cutting through the silence. "My doctor examined you. You have pneumonia and severe malnutrition. He left antibiotics and gave you an IV while you slept. You'll stay here until you're well enough to tell me everything you know." Elena tried to sit up, but her body protested. "I can't stay here. I have to go. They'll find me." "Who will find you?" Marco leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you running from, Elena?" She closed her eyes, tears leaking from the corners. She had known this moment would come eventually. After weeks of living on the streets, hiding in abandoned buildings, going hungry because she was too afraid to stay in one place long enough to find work, she had finally given in to the need to confess her sins at Mrs. Salvatore's grave. She had hoped to simply tell her story to the headstone and then disappear, maybe find a way to end her own suffering. But now she was trapped in the home of the most dangerous man in the city, and she owed him the truth. "I'm running from the people who killed your mother," Elena said quietly, "and from the guilt of knowing I helped them do it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Marco stood slowly, his hand moving to his waistband where she could see the outline of a gun. His face was a mask of controlled fury, the kind of expression that probably preceded violence. Elena didn't flinch. At this point, death might be a mercy. "You have 30 seconds to explain before I put a bullet in your head," Marco said, his voice calm despite the threat. Elena took a shaky breath. "I didn't know they were going to kill her. I swear I didn't know. I thought I was just helping her get better medication. They told me it would ease her pain, help her sleep peacefully. I was so stupid, so naive." "Start from the beginning," Marco ordered, though he didn't sit back down. He stood over her like an avenging angel, his hand still resting on his weapon. "Leave nothing out." She nodded weakly and began her story. She had been hired by the nursing agency 8 months before Mrs. Salvatore's death. Elena had just finished her nursing certification, drowning in student debt and desperate for work. The agency had sent her to care for an elderly woman with heart problems and diabetes, nothing unusual. But from the first day, Elena had loved Mrs. Salvatore. The old woman was kind, funny, and endlessly interested in Elena's life. She had treated Elena like a daughter, asking about her dreams, encouraging her studies, even helping her practice for exams. "She talked about you all the time," Elena continued, her voice breaking. "She was so proud of you. She knew what kind of business you were in. But she said you had a good heart underneath everything. She said you protected people who couldn't protect themselves, that you took care of your family. She made you sound like a hero." Marco's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Elena could see the pain flickering behind his cold exterior. The son who had lost his mother and never had the chance to say goodbye properly. 3 months before Mrs. Salvatore died, Elena had been approached by a man at a coffee shop near the house. He had known her name, known where she worked, and known that she was struggling to pay her bills. He had offered her $5,000 to simply swap Mrs. Salvatore's regular medication with pills he would provide. He had shown her a medical license, claimed to be a specialist who believed the current treatment plan was inadequate. The new medication would help Mrs. Salvatore feel better, he had insisted. It was perfectly safe. "I needed the money so badly," Elena whispered, shame washing over her again. "My mother was sick too back in my hometown. She needed surgery we couldn't afford. I told myself that if this doctor really believed different medication would help Mrs. Salvatore, then maybe it was the right thing to do. Maybe her regular doctor was missing something. I convinced myself it wasn't wrong, but deep down Elena had known something was off. The man had been too insistent, too secretive. He had made her promise not to tell anyone, claiming that Mrs. Salvatore's regular doctor was stubborn and wouldn't consider alternative treatments. Looking back, every word had been a red flag, but Elena had been desperate and foolish. "What happened after you switched the medication?" Marco's voice was dangerously quiet. Elena swallowed hard. At first, nothing seemed different. Mrs. Salvatore appeared to be the same, maybe a little more tired than usual. But then, about 2 weeks after I made the switch, she started having episodes. Her heart would race. She would become confused and disoriented. I called her regular doctor immediately, scared that I had made a terrible mistake. But the man who had given me the pills called me first. He said it was just an adjustment period, that I needed to keep quiet or I would lose my nursing license for practicing medicine without authorization. That was when Elena had realized she had been used. She had threatened to go to the police to tell Mrs. Salvatore's real doctor everything, but the man had calmly explained that if she did, he would make sure her mother never got the surgery she needed. More than that, he would make sure everyone knew that Elena had deliberately poisoned an elderly woman for money. He had recordings of their conversations, edited to make it sound like Elena had approached him about ways to harm her patient. He had photographs of her accepting the money. She would go to prison and her mother would die. So I kept giving her the pills, Elena said, her voice hollow. Every day I watched her get weaker and I kept poisoning her. I tried to reduce the dosage, but he was watching somehow. He always knew when I didn't follow his instructions. Then one night, Mrs. Salvatore had a massive heart attack. I called the ambulance. I tried to save her, but it was too late. The medication had damaged her heart beyond repair. Marco was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with barely contained rage. "Give me a name." "Who was this man?" "I never knew his real name," Elena said. "He called himself Dr. Russo, but I'm sure that was fake. After your mother died, I went to the address where we used to meet. It was an empty warehouse. He never contacted me again. The guilt was eating me alive, but I was too afraid to go to the police. Then 3 weeks ago I saw him. He was at a restaurant with other men, laughing like he didn't have a care in the world. I followed him, trying to work up the courage to confront him or call the police. But he spotted me. The next day my apartment was ransacked and there was a note warning me to disappear if I wanted to live. She had been running ever since, sleeping in shelters and on the streets, too terrified to go home or contact anyone she knew. She had pawned everything she owned just to survive, and she was slowly wasting away from illness and starvation. The only thing that had kept her going was the need to confess to Mrs. Salvatore, to apologize for her unforgivable betrayal. "I deserve whatever you do to me," Elena finished, meeting Marco's eyes for the first time since she had started her story. "I killed her. I'm responsible for your mother's death, and I'll never forgive myself for it. So if you want to shoot me, I won't fight it. At least then I can stop running." Marco stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly he moved his hand away from his gun and walked to the window. His shoulders were rigid with tension, his fists clenched at his sides. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled but filled with a cold determination that made Elena's blood freeze. "You're not going to die, Elena. Not yet. You're going to help me find everyone involved in my mother's murder, and you're going to watch as I destroy them. Only after they've all paid for what they did will I decide what happens to you." The rain fell in heavy sheets that November evening, turning the cemetery grounds into a blur of gray headstones and weeping willows. Marco Salvatore stood beneath a black umbrella, his expensive Italian shoes sinking slightly into the mud as he made his weekly visit to his mother's grave. The cemetery was usually empty at this hour, which was exactly why he chose this time. A man in his position couldn't afford to show weakness in public, and visiting his mother's resting place was the only time he allowed himself to feel anything beyond the cold calculation required to run the most powerful crime family in the city. As he approached the familiar marble headstone, Marco stopped in his tracks. Someone was already there. A young woman knelt in front of his mother's grave, her thin jacket soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her face. She wasn't holding an umbrella, and she seemed completely unaware of the downpour. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs as she traced her fingers over the engraved name on the stone. Marco's hand instinctively moved toward the gun concealed in his jacket. Nobody knew about this place. He had kept his mother's burial location a closely guarded secret to prevent enemies from desecrating her grave. Yet here was this stranger, weeping as though she had lost someone dear. His bodyguards, stationed discreetly at the cemetery entrance, hadn't warned him of any intrusion. Someone would pay for this security breach. He moved closer, his footsteps masked by the rain. The woman continued to cry, whispering something he couldn't quite hear. Marco cleared his throat and she jumped, scrambling backward in the mud. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale with exhaustion. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with delicate features that were currently twisted in fear as she stared up at the imposing figure before her. "Who are you?" Marco's voice was cold, dangerous. "How do you know about this grave?" The woman's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but only a sob came out. She shook her head frantically as if trying to clear it, then looked back at the headstone with such profound sadness that Marco felt an unfamiliar twist in his chest. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." Marco's blood ran cold. Those words, that phrase, it was something he had said himself, countless times in the darkness of his own grief. His mother had been killed 5 years ago in what the police called a robbery gone wrong. But Marco knew better. It had been a message from a rival family, a brutal reminder that no one was untouchable. He had spent years hunting down everyone responsible, making them pay in ways that would haunt their final moments. Yet the guilt remained. He had been too late to save her. "Answer my question," he demanded, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "Who are you?" The woman struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. Up close, Marco could see she was even younger than he had initially thought, and clearly unwell. Her skin had a grayish tint and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She looked like she hadn't eaten properly in weeks. "My name is Elena," she said, her voice hoarse. "Elena Martinez. I used to work for your mother. I was her home care nurse during her final months." Marco's mind raced through his memories. He had hired a nursing service to care for his mother when she had gotten sick, but he had been traveling frequently for business at the time. He had trusted his second-in-command to vet the staff. He tried to recall if he had ever met this Elena, but nothing came to mind. He had been so consumed with expanding his territory and eliminating threats that he had missed precious time with his mother. "My mother never mentioned you," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he realized how little his mother had shared about her daily life during those final months. She had always been more interested in hearing about him, about whether he was eating well, whether he was being careful. She had worried about him until her last breath. "She wouldn't have," Elena replied, wrapping her arms around herself as she shivered in the cold rain. "Mrs. Salvatore was a very private woman. She made me promise never to tell you about her condition. She didn't want you to worry or change your life for her sake. She said you had important work to do." A flash of anger surged through Marco. Important work. He had been consolidating power, eliminating rivals, building an empire while his mother suffered in silence. If he had known how serious her condition was, he would have dropped everything. But she had hidden it from him, and apparently this nurse had helped her do it. "Why are you here?" Marco asked, his voice hardening again. "What do you want?" Elena's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't want anything. I just needed to tell her I'm sorry. I failed her. I promised I would keep her safe, and I failed." "What are you talking about?" Marco stepped closer, his patience wearing thin. "My mother died from her illness. The doctor said there was nothing anyone could do." "No." Elena shook her head violently. "That's not true. She was murdered, Mr. Salvatore, and I'm the only one who knows the truth." The world seemed to tilt beneath Marco's feet. He had suspected foul play, had investigated every angle, had tortured and killed everyone even remotely connected to his mother's death. The official cause had been heart failure, brought on by her existing conditions. The doctors, the coroner, everyone had confirmed it. He had found evidence of the rival family's involvement, only because they had been in the area that day, casing his mother's home. He had assumed they had frightened her, perhaps even confronted her, causing the heart attack. "Explain," he commanded, his voice deadly quiet. "Now." Elena swayed again, and this time her knees buckled. Marco caught her before she hit the ground, surprised by how light she was, how fragile she felt in his arms. Her skin was burning with fever despite the cold rain. Whatever information she had, he wouldn't get it if she died here in the cemetery. "When did you last eat?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "I don't remember," Elena mumbled, her eyes beginning to close. "Yesterday, maybe. It doesn't matter." "I just needed to apologize to her first before—" "Before what?" Marco prompted. But Elena had lost consciousness. He lifted her easily, signaling to his bodyguards as he carried her toward his car. Whatever secrets this woman held about his mother's death, he would learn them. And if she had been involved in any way, if this was some elaborate scheme, she would regret ever speaking his mother's name. But as he looked down at her pale face, at the obvious signs of suffering and guilt etched into her features, something told him that Elena Martinez was as much a victim as his mother had been. The question was, a victim of what? Or whom?